Mark Chen pulled into the driveway of 1247 Maple Street and turned off the engine. He sat for a moment, looking at the house that would soon be their home. The two-story house had cream-colored walls and a dark green roof. Small flowers grew in neat rows along the walkway. The grass was cut short and even. Everything looked perfect. Sarah opened the passenger door and stepped out. She stretched her arms above her head and smiled. After 8 years in the Navy, she was ready for a quiet life. No more sleeping on ships. No more being away from Mark for months at a time. Just a normal house in a normal neighborhood where they could start their family. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, walking up to the front door. She ran her hand along the smooth wood. "I can't believe it's really ours." Mark joined her on the front porch. He pulled out the keys the real estate agent had given them that morning. The metal felt cold in his hand. "Are you sure about this place?" he asked. "The HOA fees are pretty high, and all those rules they gave us." Sarah laughed. "Mark, you worry too much. We can handle some rules. I've been following orders for 8 years. How hard can it be?" They walked through the empty house together. Their footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors. The kitchen had white cabinets and granite counters. Large windows let in lots of light. The living room was big enough for the couch and TV they had been keeping in storage. "The master bedroom is huge," Sarah called from upstairs. Mark climbed the stairs to find her standing in the middle of a large room with a walk-in closet. "We can finally get a king-size bed." Mark smiled. Sarah had been sleeping on narrow Navy bunks for so long. She deserved a comfortable bed. She deserved all of this. They had looked at dozens of houses over the past 3 months. Some were too small. Others were in bad neighborhoods. A few were too expensive. But Willowbrook Estates was different. The streets were clean. The houses were well kept. Children played safely in the yards while their parents watched from porches. The real estate agent, Mrs. Patterson, had explained how the HOA worked. "The Homeowners Association makes sure everyone follows the same rules," she had said. "That way property values stay high. Everyone's investment is protected. The rules seemed reasonable enough. Keep your grass cut. Don't park on the street overnight. Paint your house only in approved colors. Put your trash cans away quickly after pickup day. Nothing too crazy." "It's like being in the military," Sarah had joked. "Everyone follows the rules and everything runs smoothly." Mark was not so sure. He had grown up in a neighborhood where people did what they wanted with their own houses. His father had painted their house bright yellow because his mother liked it. Their neighbor had a garden full of vegetables and flowers that grew wild. Nobody complained, but Sarah was excited about Willowbrook Estates. She liked how organized everything looked. After years of chaos and uncertainty in the Navy, she wanted order and peace. They signed the papers on a Tuesday morning in October. The house cost more than they had planned to spend, but Mark's job as an accountant paid well. Sarah would start her new job in cybersecurity after the first of the year. They could afford the mortgage and the HOA fees. Moving day was exhausting. Mark's back ached from carrying boxes. Sarah directed the moving truck drivers with the same authority she had used on Navy ships. By evening, their furniture was in place, though boxes still covered every surface. Their new neighbors seemed friendly enough. Mrs. Williams from next door brought them cookies and welcomed them to the neighborhood. She was an older woman with gray hair and a kind smile. "You'll love it here," she said. "It's so peaceful, and the HOA keeps everything nice." A few days later, a man knocked on their door. He was tall and thin with a serious expression. He introduced himself as Robert Blackwell, the HOA treasurer. "Welcome to Willowbrook Estates," he said, though he did not smile. "I wanted to give you these." He handed Mark a thick folder full of papers. "These are all the HOA rules and regulations. Please read them carefully. We expect all residents to follow them exactly." Mark flipped through the pages. There were rules about everything. What kind of mailbox to have, how tall the grass could be, what decorations were allowed, when trash cans could be put out and when they had to be brought back in. "This is a lot of rules," Mark said. Robert's expression did not change. "Rules maintain order. Without them, The neighborhood would fall apart. Property values would drop. Nobody wants that. After Robert left, Sarah looked through the folder. Some of these are pretty specific, she said. Listen to this. Mailboxes must be positioned exactly 18 inches from the curb. Who measures that? Mark was reading another page. And look at this one. Vehicles may not be parked in driveways overnight unless they are in an enclosed garage. We don't have a garage. Sarah frowned. That can't be right. Mrs. Patterson never mentioned that. And look outside. Half the houses have cars in their driveways. They spent the evening reading through all the rules. Some made sense, like keeping the yard clean and not making too much noise. Others seemed overly strict, like the rule that said trash cans had to be put away within 2 hours of pickup. Maybe they don't enforce all of these strictly, Sarah suggested. Lots of organizations have rules on paper that they don't really use. Mark hoped she was right. But something about Robert Blackwell's serious tone made him nervous. The first few weeks in their new home were wonderful. Mark's commute to work was shorter than before. Sarah enjoyed setting up their house and exploring the neighborhood. She found a nice coffee shop nearby and a gym where she could keep up her fitness routine. They met more of their neighbors. Most were friendly and welcoming. The Johnsons across the street had children who played in their front yard. The elderly couple next to them, the Garcias, kept a beautiful garden. Everything seemed perfect until the first violation notice arrived. Mark found it stuck to their front door when he came home from work on a Thursday evening. It was a yellow piece of paper with official-looking text. Violation notice, it said in large letters at the top. Below that, property, 1247 Maple Street. Violation, mailbox positioned 20 inches from curb instead of required 18 inches. Fine, 25 Rs. Please correct immediately. Mark stared at the paper. He walked to their mailbox and looked at it. It seemed fine to him. Exactly like all the other mailboxes on the street. Sarah came outside to see what he was looking at. What's that? She asked. Mark handed her the violation notice. Sarah read it twice. Are you kidding me? She said. 2 inches. Someone measured our mailbox. They looked up and down the street. All the mailboxes looked the same distance from the curb. Mark could not see any difference between theirs and their neighbors. This has to be a mistake, Sarah said. I'll call the HOA office tomorrow and get it sorted out. But when Sarah called the next morning, the woman who answered the phone was not helpful. All violations are carefully documented, she said. If you received a notice, then there was a violation. You can pay the fine online or by mail. But I want to dispute it, Sarah said. Our mailbox looks exactly like everyone else's. You can request a hearing, the woman said. The next board meeting is in 3 weeks. You'll have 5 minutes to present your case. 3 weeks seemed like a long time to wait, and it was just $25. Sarah and Mark decided to pay the fine and move the mailbox 2 inches closer to the curb. Mark spent his Saturday morning digging up the mailbox post and moving it. He measured carefully to make sure it was exactly 18 inches from the curb. The work was harder than he expected. His hands were sore and dirty by the time he finished. There, he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. That should take care of it. But as he looked at their mailbox, now slightly closer to the curb than their neighbors, Mark had an uneasy feeling. This was just the beginning. 2 weeks after fixing their mailbox, another yellow notice appeared on the Chen's front door. This time, Mark found it when he went out to get the morning newspaper. His stomach dropped when he saw the familiar official-looking paper. Sarah, he called into the house. We got another one. Sarah came to the door, still in her pajamas and holding a cup of coffee. She took the notice from Mark and read it out loud. Violation. Grass height exceeds maximum allowed length of 2.5 inches. Multiple areas measured at 3 inches. Fine. $50. Please correct within 48 hours. Mark looked at their front yard. The grass looked fine to him. Green and healthy. Maybe a little longer than some yards, but not by much. He had mowed it just a week ago. This is crazy, Sarah said. Who goes around measuring grass with a ruler? Mark walked onto the lawn and knelt down. He could not tell if the grass was really 3 inches tall. It looked normal to him. He looked at the neighbors' yards. The Johnsons' grass across the street looked about the same length. So did the Garcias next door. I don't understand, Mark said. Why are they picking on us? Sarah was reading the notice again. Look at this. It says the violation was reported by concerned community member. Someone called in a complaint about our grass. They spent that Saturday morning mowing the lawn. Again. Mark went over every inch twice to make sure it was short enough. Sarah used a measuring tape to check random spots. Most areas were now about 2 inches tall. That should do it, Mark said, putting the lawnmower back in their small storage shed. But the violations did not stop. The next week brought another notice. This time, it was about their trash cans. Violation. Refuse containers visible from street longer than permitted time. Containers observed at curb for 4 hours after pickup completion. Fine, $75. Sarah was getting angry now. 4 hours? The trash truck came at 10 in the morning. We both work full time. How are we supposed to run home in the middle of the day to move trash cans? Mark called the HOA office to complain. The same woman answered the phone. Her voice was cold and unfriendly. The rules are very clear, she said. Trash containers must be removed from the curb within 2 hours of pickup. But we were both at work, Mark explained. We came home as soon as we could. That's not the HOA's problem, the woman said. You need to arrange your schedule to follow the rules, or hire someone to move your containers for you. Mark hung up the phone feeling frustrated. Hire someone to move trash cans? That was ridiculous. The violations kept coming. Every week or two, another yellow notice appeared on their door. Their welcome mat was the wrong size. Sarah's motorcycle made too much noise. They had put up a small American flag in their front window without permission. Each fine was bigger than the last. $25 became $50. $50 became $75. The notice about the flag was $100. Sarah was especially upset about the flag violation. I served my country for 8 years, she said, holding the yellow paper. And now they won't let me display the American flag? Mark called the HOA office again. This time, a man answered. He said his name was Robert Blackwell, the treasurer, who had visited them when they first moved in. The flag is not the problem, Robert said. The problem is that you hung it without getting approval first. All exterior decorations must be approved by the architectural committee. It's just a small flag in our window, Mark said. How is that hurting anyone? Rules are rules, Robert said. If we let one person break them, then everyone will want to break them. Then the whole neighborhood falls apart. Mark tried to stay calm. Can we get approval now? Retroactively? You'll have to submit a formal request, Robert said. The committee meets once a month. There's a $50 application fee. If they approve it, you can keep the flag. If not, you have to take it down and pay the fine. Mark could not believe what he was hearing. A $50 fee just to ask permission to hang an American flag, plus the $100 fine they already owed? That evening, Mark and Sarah sat at their kitchen table with all the violation notices spread out in front of them. They had received 7 notices in 2 months. The total fines came to over $400. This is insane, Sarah said. We're good neighbors. We keep our house nice. We don't cause trouble. Why are they doing this to us? Mark had been wondering the same thing. Maybe we should talk to some of the other neighbors, see if this is happening to them too. The next day was Saturday. Mark decided to walk around the neighborhood and chat with people working in their yards. He started with Mrs. Williams next door. Oh, you're getting violations too, she said, looking surprised. I've lived here for 10 years and never got a single one. That's so strange. Mark talked to the Johnsons across the street. They had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 5 years. No violations. The Garcias had been there for 8 years. No violations. The pattern was the same everywhere Mark went. Longtime residents had never received violation notices. Even when their grass looked long or their trash cans stayed out late, Mark felt sick to his stomach. They were being targeted. That afternoon, Sarah decided to do some research. She got out her laptop and started looking up information about the HOA board members. It did not take long to find what she was looking for. "Mark, come look at this," she called from the living room. Mark sat down next to her on the couch. Sarah had found the HOA website. It had photos and biographies of all the board members. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a photo of a stern-looking woman with gray hair. "Margaret Blackwell, HOA president, and look who the treasurer is, Robert Blackwell. They're married." Mark read Margaret's biography. She was a retired real estate agent. She had lived in Willowbrook Estates for 15 years. The bio said she was committed to maintaining the high standards that make our community special. "Keep reading," Sarah said. She had found an old newsletter from the previous year. One article talked about a house that had been for sale on Maple Street. The same house Mark and Sarah had bought. "Listen to this," Sarah said, reading from the newsletter. Margaret Blackwell expressed interest in the property for her nephew, who is looking to start a family in our wonderful community. Mark felt his anger rising. Her nephew wanted our house? Sarah nodded. "It looks like it. And when we bought it instead..." She gestured at the pile of violation notices on the coffee table. "So this is revenge?" Mark asked. "Because we bought a house her nephew wanted?" "I think so," Sarah said. "And I think it's going to get worse." She was right. The next week brought 2 violation notices, one for parking their car in the driveway overnight, another for having curtains that were the wrong color. Mark called a lawyer that his friend had recommended. The lawyer listened to their story and asked to see all the violation notices. "This does sound like harassment," the lawyer said. "But HOA cases are tricky. You signed a contract agreeing to follow their rules. Even if the enforcement seems unfair, they have a lot of power. So there's nothing we can do?" Mark asked. "You can fight it," the lawyer said. "But it will be expensive, and it could take years. Sometimes it's easier to just pay the fines and try to avoid future violations." Mark and Sarah left the lawyer's office feeling defeated. They had saved for years to buy their dream house. Now they were spending hundreds of dollars on fines for ridiculous violations. The harassment was affecting their daily life. Mark found himself checking the grass length every few days. Sarah worried about every little detail of their house's appearance. They both rushed home from work to move trash cans and check for new violation notices. "This isn't how I imagined our life here," Sarah said one evening. They were eating dinner at their kitchen table. Another violation notice sat unopened on the counter. "I thought we'd be happy here." Mark reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll figure something out," he said. "Maybe we can talk to the other board members, explain what's happening." But Sarah was not sure talking would help. She had dealt with bullies before in the Navy. Sometimes the only way to handle them was to fight back. She just had to figure out how. Winter arrived early in Willowbrook Estates. Snow covered the perfectly manicured lawns, and Christmas decorations appeared on houses throughout the neighborhood. Mark and Sarah hoped the cold weather might bring a break from the HOA violations. They were wrong. The day after their first snowfall, another yellow notice appeared on their door. This time the violation was about snow removal. Violation: failure to remove snow from sidewalk within 12 hours of snowfall conclusion. Fine, $100. Repeat violations will result in increased penalties. Sarah stared at the notice in disbelief. "The snow stopped falling at midnight," she said. "It's only 10 in the morning. How is that 12 hours? Mark was already getting the snow shovel from their storage shed. His breath made white clouds in the cold air. "I'll clear it now," he said, "before they fine us again." As Mark shoveled their sidewalk, he noticed something strange. The Johnsons across the street still had snow on their sidewalk. So did the Garcias next door. But no yellow violation notices hung on their doors. Sarah came outside to help. She was bundled up in her navy winter coat, the one she had worn during training in the Great Lakes. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, throwing a shovel full of snow onto their lawn. "I know," Mark said, "but what choice do we have?" The violations continued throughout the winter. Their Christmas lights were hung without proper permits. Their car was parked improperly in their own driveway. Sarah's motorcycle, covered with a tarp in their backyard, was apparently visible from a neighbor's second-story window. and violated the no commercial vehicles rule. "It's not even a commercial vehicle," Sarah protested when she called the HOA office. "It's my personal motorcycle." "All motorcycles are considered commercial vehicles under our guidelines," came the cold response from the office. Each violation notice came with a bigger fine than the last. What started as $25 penalties had grown to $150 for repeat offenses. The total amount they owed was approaching $2,000. Mark's stress was affecting his work. His boss noticed he seemed distracted during meetings. Sarah found herself waking up, in the middle of the night, worried about what new violation they might receive. The breaking point came in March. Spring was arriving, and Mark had spent the weekend cleaning up their yard after the long winter. He raked leaves, trimmed bushes, and planted new flowers in their front garden. The yard looked beautiful. On Monday evening, he found 2 violation notices on their door. The first was about the flowers. Violation: unauthorized plantings. All landscaping changes must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. Fine: $200. The second was even worse. Violation: excessive noise disturbance. Lawnmower operated outside permitted hours. Fine: $300. Mark called Sarah at work. "You need to come home," he said. "This is getting out of hand." When Sarah arrived, Mark showed her the notices. Her face turned red with anger as she read them. Excessive noise. You mowed the lawn at 2 in the afternoon on Saturday. That's not exactly the middle of the night. Mark sat down heavily on their couch. "I don't know what to do anymore. We're going to owe them $3,000 soon. And for what? Planting flowers in our own yard?" Sarah paced around their living room. Her military training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. This was personal. "We need to find out exactly who's behind this," she said. "And we need proof." The next morning, Sarah took a day off work. She spent the day driving around Willowbrook Estates, taking photos with her phone. She documented everything: grass that looked longer than theirs, cars parked in driveways, Christmas decorations still hanging in March, trash cans left out past the 2-hour limit. What she found confirmed their suspicions. Other residents were breaking the same rules they were being fined for, but only the Chen family was getting violations. Sarah also did something else. She parked across the street from their house and waited. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a blue Honda Civic drove slowly down Maple Street. The car stopped in front of their house. A woman got out and walked up to their front door. Sarah recognized her from the HOA website photos. Margaret Blackwell, the HOA president. Margaret spent several minutes looking at their house. She walked around their yard, examining their grass and flowers. She took photos with her phone. She even measured the distance from their mailbox to the curb with a small tape measure she carried in her purse. After 15 minutes, Margaret got back in her car and drove away. 2 hours later, another violation notice appeared on the Chen's door. This time it was about weeds in their flower bed that Sarah could not even see. That evening, Sarah called an emergency meeting with Mark. She spread all her photos out on their dining room table. "Look at this," she said, showing him pictures of other houses. "The Williamses have the exact same flowers we do. No violation. The Peters family has a motorcycle in their backyard too. No violation. And look at this house on Oak Street. Their grass is at least 4 inches tall." Mark studied the photos. The evidence was clear. They were being singled out. "What do we do with this?" he asked. "We fight back," Sarah said. "I've been reading the HOA bylaws. There are rules about how violations have to be documented, procedures that have to be followed, and I don't think Margaret is following them." Sarah had discovered that all violation notices had to be approved by at least 2 board members, but all of their notices were signed only by Margaret. She had also found a rule that said violations had to be witnessed by board members during scheduled neighborhood inspections, not during random drive-bys. "She's been making up violations and signing fake notices," Sarah said. "That's fraud." Mark felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "Can we prove it?" "I think so," Sarah said. "But we need more evidence. And we need to be smart about how we present it." Sarah started documenting everything. She kept a detailed log of every violation notice they received. She took photos of their property every day to show that many of the claimed violations did not exist. She also started talking to neighbors. What she learned surprised her. Several other residents had also received unfair violations, but they had been too intimidated to complain. The elderly couple on Elm Street had been fined for having a bird feeder that allegedly attracted pest animals. A young family with small children had been cited for chalk drawings on their sidewalk. All of the targeted families had one thing in common. They were newcomers to the neighborhood, people who had moved in within the past 2 years. "It's not just about us," Sarah told Mark. "She's trying to force out anyone who didn't live here when she was queen of the neighborhood." Sarah also made another discovery. She found old HOA meeting minutes online that showed Margaret had opposed several rule changes in recent years. Changes that would have made the community more welcoming to families with children and people who worked full-time jobs. "She wants Willowbrook Estates to stay exactly the way it was 15 years ago," Sarah said. "She sees new residents as a threat to her control." The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Williams, their elderly neighbor, knocked on their door one evening in April. "I need to tell you something," she said, looking nervous. "About Margaret Blackwell." Mrs. Williams invited them over for coffee. In her cozy kitchen, she explained what she had witnessed. "I saw Margaret putting violation notices on your door," she said, "multiple times, but here's the thing. She was doing it at night, around 10 or 11 o'clock. Who does official HOA business at that hour?" Mrs. Williams had also overheard a phone conversation between Margaret and her husband Robert. They had been discussing how to get rid of the troublemakers before they infected the whole neighborhood with their attitude. "She specifically mentioned your family," Mrs. Williams said. "She called you both military types who think they can do whatever they want." Sarah felt her anger flare. Military types? She had served her country with honor. How dare Margaret use her service as an insult? "Are you willing to testify to this?" Sarah asked. "If we challenge the violations?" Mrs. Williams hesitated. "Margaret has a lot of power in this neighborhood. I don't want to make trouble for myself." Sarah understood. Margaret had spent years building her control over the HOA. Many residents were afraid to cross her, but Sarah was not afraid. She had faced enemy fire in foreign countries. She had commanded respect from sailors twice her size. A petty neighborhood bully was not going to drive her from her home. "Mark," she said that night as they lay in bed, "I think it's time to take this to the next level." "What do you mean?" he asked. "The next HOA board meeting is in 2 weeks," Sarah said. "I think we should attend, and I think we should present all of our evidence publicly." Mark was nervous about confronting Margaret and the board directly, but he was also tired of being pushed around. "Okay," he said. "Let's do it." Sarah smiled in the darkness. She was ready for battle. The letter arrived on a Friday morning in late April. Mark found it in their mailbox when he left for work. The envelope was thick and official-looking, with the law firm's name printed in bold letters across the top. "Sarah," he called into the house. "You need to see this." Sarah came outside, still in her robe and slippers. She took the envelope from Mark and tore it open. Her face grew pale as she read the letter. "What is it?" Mark asked. Sarah read the letter out loud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen, our client, the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, has instructed us to inform you that your account is severely delinquent. You currently owe $3,247 in unpaid fines and penalties." Mark felt his stomach drop. $3,000. Sarah continued reading. "If full payment is not received within 30 days, the association will begin foreclosure proceedings against your property. We strongly advise you to contact our office immediately to arrange payment." The letter was signed by someone named David Mitchell at the law firm of Mitchell, Barnes & Associates. Mark sat down on their front steps. "They can't actually foreclose on our house, can they? Over HOA fines?" Sarah sat down next to him. "I don't know, but I'm not willing to find out." The letter had shaken both of them. Up until now, the violations had felt like harassment, annoying and unfair, but not truly dangerous. This felt different. This was a real threat to their home. Mark was ready to give up. "Maybe we should just pay it," he said. "It's a lot of money, but it's not worth losing the house." But Sarah was not ready to surrender. "Pay it with what money? And then what? Do you think Margaret will stop harassing us if we pay? She'll just keep finding new violations until we can't afford to live here anymore." Sarah was right. The fines had been getting bigger and more frequent. Even if they paid the current amount, they would probably owe thousands more within a few months. "Plus," Sarah added, "I've been doing more research on foreclosure laws. In most states, HOAs can't actually foreclose for unpaid fines. They can put a lien on your house, but foreclosure is much harder." Mark felt a small amount of relief. "So this letter is just a scare tactic?" "Probably," Sarah said. "But we still need to take it seriously, and we need to fight back harder than we have been." That weekend, Sarah threw herself into research. She spent hours on her laptop, reading HOA laws and court cases. She found several examples of homeowners who had successfully fought back against abusive HOAs. What she learned gave her hope. Courts generally did not like HOAs that enforced rules unfairly or selectively. If they could prove that Margaret was targeting them while ignoring identical violations by other residents, they might have a case. Sarah also discovered something else interesting. The letter from the law firm had been sent without following proper procedures. According to the HOA's own bylaws, any legal action had to be approved by a majority vote of the board, but there was no record of such a vote in the meeting minutes. "I think Margaret sent this letter on her own," Sarah told Mark, "without getting approval from the other board members." Mark was not sure what difference that made. "She's the president. Doesn't she have the authority to do that?" "Not according to their own rules," Sarah said. "The HOA bylaws are very specific about what requires board approval. Legal action is definitely on that list." Sarah decided to test her theory. She called the HOA office and asked to speak with Robert Blackwell, the treasurer. "I'm calling about the letter we received from your law firm," she said when Robert answered. "I wanted to confirm that this legal action was properly authorized." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What letter?" Robert asked. Sarah described the foreclosure threat letter. Another long pause. I'll have to look into that and get back to you," Robert said finally. He never called back. But something interesting happened the next day. Sarah received a call from Margaret Blackwell herself. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said, her voice sharp and cold. "I understand you've been asking questions about our legal procedures." "That's right," Sarah said. "I want to make sure everything is being done properly." "Let me be very clear with you," Margaret said. "The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association has the full authority to enforce its rules. If you continue to violate those rules, we will take whatever action is necessary to protect our community." Sarah kept her voice calm and professional. "I understand, but I also want to make sure that all enforcement actions follow your own bylaws, for everyone's protection." Margaret's tone became even colder. "Mrs. Chen, I think you misunderstand your situation. You and your husband are not welcome in this neighborhood. You don't fit in here. It would be better for everyone if you simply moved somewhere more suitable." Sarah felt her anger rising, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Are you suggesting that we sell our home?" "I'm suggesting that you consider whether this community is really right for you," Margaret said, "before things get more unpleasant." After Margaret hung up, Sarah sat in her kitchen feeling shaken. The conversation had sounded like a threat. Margaret was not even pretending to follow proper procedures anymore. Sarah decided it was time to contact the other board members directly. According to the HOA website, there were 5 people on the board: Margaret, her husband Robert, and 3 other residents. The first person Sarah called was Jennifer Martinez, who served as the secretary. Jennifer seemed surprised to hear from her. "I'm calling about all the violation notices we've been receiving," Sarah explained, "and about the letter from the law firm. I wanted to understand the board's position on these issues." "What violation notices?" Jennifer asked. "And what letter?" Sarah described the dozens of violations they had received over the past 6 months. Jennifer sounded genuinely confused. I haven't heard about any of this, she said. Margaret handles most of the day-to-day enforcement, but she's supposed to report all violations to the board monthly. I don't remember seeing your address on any reports. Sarah's heart started beating faster. Are you saying the board doesn't know about the violations we've received? Apparently not, Jennifer said. This is very concerning. Can you email me copies of all the notices you've received? I want to look into this. Sarah sent Jennifer every violation notice they had received. 2 hours later, Jennifer called back. This is completely unacceptable, Jennifer said. Many of these violations were never approved by the board, and some of them are for things that aren't even against our rules. Jennifer explained that the board was supposed to review all violation notices before they were sent out. Margaret had been bypassing this process for months. What about the letter from the law firm? Sarah asked. That's even worse, Jennifer said. Legal action absolutely requires board approval. Margaret had no authority to have that letter sent. Sarah felt a surge of hope. Finally, someone in the HOA was taking their side. What can we do about this? She asked. I'm calling an emergency board meeting, Jennifer said. This needs to be addressed immediately. But Margaret was not going to give up easily. The next morning, Sarah and Mark found their car tires slashed. All 4 tires on Sarah's motorcycle were also flat. Sarah called the police, but there was no proof of who had done it. The officer who took the report seemed skeptical that it was related to their HOA dispute. Probably just random vandalism, he said. Happens sometimes in nice neighborhoods like this. But Sarah knew better. The timing was too convenient. Margaret was escalating her campaign against them. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. Jennifer had sent a formal notice to all board members, as required by the bylaws. 2 days before the meeting, Margaret called Sarah again. I hope you're not planning to make trouble at Thursday's meeting, she said. I'm planning to present the facts, Sarah replied. Just like any resident has the right to do. Mrs. Chen, Margaret said, you're new here. You don't understand how things work in this community. Some people have been here for many years. We've built something special, and we're not going to let newcomers destroy it. Sarah had heard enough. Mrs. Blackwell, are you threatening me? I'm warning you, Margaret said. If you try to cause problems at the meeting, you'll find that things can get much worse for you and your husband. After Margaret hung up, Sarah sat in her living room feeling frustrated and angry. But she also felt something else. Determination. She had faced down enemies in war zones. She had commanded respect from people who initially doubted her because of her age and gender. She was not going to be intimidated by a neighborhood bully. Sarah spent the next 2 days preparing for the board meeting. She organized all their evidence into a clear presentation. Photos of other properties that violated the same rules they were cited for. Copies of HOA bylaws that Margaret had ignored. Documentation of the unauthorized legal threat. She also prepared herself mentally. This would be her chance to fight back publicly, to expose Margaret's abuse of power and hopefully put an end to the harassment. Mark was nervous about the confrontation. Are you sure about this? He asked. Margaret seems like she's capable of anything. Sarah looked at him with the same determination she had shown during her military service. Mark, we can't let her drive us out of our home. If we don't stand up to her now, who will she target next? The night before the meeting, Sarah laid out her clothes carefully. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center buzzing with activity when Mark and Sarah arrived Thursday evening. Cars filled the parking lot, and residents walked toward the building in small groups, talking quietly among themselves. Word had spread about the emergency board meeting, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had come to see what would happen. Sarah carried a thick folder containing all their evidence. Her hands were steady, but her heart was beating fast. She had faced tense situations before during her Navy service, but this felt different. This was personal. Mark squeezed her hand as they walked toward the entrance. You've got this, he said quietly. Inside the community center, folding chairs were arranged in rows facing a long table at the front of the room. Margaret Blackwell sat in the center chair, flanked by the other board members. She wore a dark blue suit and had her gray hair pulled back severely. Her expression was stern and unwelcoming. To Margaret's right sat her husband, Robert, the treasurer. He avoided eye contact with the residents filing into the room. On Margaret's left were the three other board members: Jennifer Martinez, the secretary who had called for the emergency meeting; David Park, a newer member who worked as an engineer; and Helen Foster, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. Sarah and Mark found seats in the third row, close enough to see the board members' faces clearly. Sarah noticed that Margaret kept glancing at them with obvious hostility. More residents continued to arrive. Sarah recognized some of their neighbors: Mrs. Williams from next door, the Johnson family from across the street, and the young couple with children who lived on Oak Street. But there were also many faces she did not know. As the room filled up, Sarah began to realize just how big this meeting had become. The normal monthly board meetings typically drew only a handful of residents. Tonight, there were at least 50. People packed into the community center. At exactly 7 o'clock, Margaret called the meeting to order. She banged a small gavel on the table and the room gradually became quiet. This emergency meeting has been called to address certain complaints about HOA enforcement procedures, Margaret said, her voice carrying a tone of irritation. However, I want to remind everyone that this board has been serving this community faithfully for many years. We have maintained property values and community standards that benefit all residents. Jennifer Martinez leaned toward her microphone. Actually, Margaret, the meeting was called to address specific allegations of procedural violations and unauthorized actions. I think we should get straight to the point. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she nodded curtly. Very well. Mrs. Chen, you requested time to address the board. You have 10 minutes. Sarah stood up and walked to the front of the room. She had prepared for this moment, but facing a room full of 50 people still felt intimidating. She took a deep breath and began. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, Sarah said, her voice clear and confident. My husband Mark and I moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months ago. We chose this neighborhood because we wanted to be part of a welcoming community, where we could raise a family. Sarah opened her folder and pulled out a stack of papers. Instead, we have been subjected to a campaign of harassment disguised as HOA enforcement. In 6 months, we have received 23 violation notices with fines totaling over $3,000. A murmur went through the room. Several residents turned to look at Margaret, whose face had become even more stern. Sarah continued. These violations include being cited for grass that was allegedly 3 inches tall instead of 2.5 inches, for planting flowers in our own front yard without permission, for displaying an American flag in our window, and for parking our car in our own driveway. She held up photos from her folder. But here's what's interesting. When I documented similar conditions at other properties throughout the neighborhood, I found that we were the only residents being cited for these supposed violations. Sarah walked closer to the board table and placed a series of photos where everyone could see them. This photo shows the Johnson family's front yard with grass that appears to be at least 4 inches tall. No violation notice. This photo shows the Williams property with the exact same flowers we were cited for having. No violation notice. The room was completely silent now. Even Margaret seemed to be paying attention to Sarah's presentation. I also discovered that many of the violation notices we received were sent without following proper HOA procedures, Sarah said. According to your own bylaws, all violations must be approved by at least 2 board members before notices are sent. But every notice we received was signed only by Mrs. Blackwell. Sarah looked directly at Margaret. Furthermore, Mrs. Blackwell sent us a letter from a law firm threatening foreclosure proceedings. This letter was sent without board approval, which is required for all legal actions according to your bylaws. Jennifer Martinez nodded and made notes on a pad of paper. David Park looked surprised and uncomfortable. Helen Foster was frowning as she looked through some papers in front of her. Sarah continued her presentation for several more minutes, methodically laying out the evidence of selective enforcement and procedural violations. When she finished, she returned to her seat feeling like she had presented her case as clearly as possible. Margaret stood up immediately. Mrs. Chen's allegations are completely unfounded, she said, her voice sharp with anger. The HOA board has the full authority to enforce community standards. Mrs. Chen and her husband have repeatedly violated clearly stated rules, and they have been notified accordingly. Margaret pointed toward Sarah and Mark. What we have here is a couple who think they can move into an established community and ignore the rules that everyone else follows. They want special treatment because of their military background. Sarah felt her anger flare at the mention of her military service, but she forced herself to remain calm. Margaret continued. This community has worked hard to maintain certain standards. We have rules for a reason. When people like the Chens move in and think they can do whatever they want, it threatens everything we've built here. David Park raised his hand. Margaret, I have to ask. Why wasn't the board informed about all these violation notices? I don't remember approving any of them. Margaret waved dismissively. Day-to-day enforcement doesn't require full board approval for every minor violation. That would be inefficient. But the bylaws specifically say, Jennifer started to say. Margaret cut her off. The bylaws give the president authority to handle routine enforcement matters. Helen Foster spoke up for the first time. Margaret, I helped write those bylaws 15 years ago. They absolutely require board approval for violation notices, and they certainly require approval for legal action. The room was getting tense. Sarah could see that some of the board members were clearly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. A man in the audience raised his hand. Sarah recognized him as Tom Bradley from Elm Street. Can I say something? He asked. Margaret looked annoyed but nodded. Tom stood up. Mrs. Chen isn't the only one who's been getting unfair violations. My wife and I got cited for having a bird feeder in our backyard. We were told it was attracting pest animals. But look around the neighborhood. Lots of people have bird feeders. We're just the ones who got fined for it. Another resident stood up. Same thing happened to us. We got a violation for our kids drawing with chalk on the sidewalk. $100 fine for chalk that washes away with the first rain. More people began speaking up. A pattern emerged of selective enforcement targeting newer residents, particularly families with children, or people who worked full-time jobs and couldn't be home during the day to immediately address minor issues. Margaret was clearly getting flustered. This is turning into chaos, she said, banging her gavel. We can't have everyone speaking at once. Jennifer Martinez leaned toward her microphone again. Actually, Margaret, I think we need to hear these concerns. It sounds like there's a systemic problem with how enforcement has been handled. Margaret stood up abruptly. I've heard enough. This meeting is getting out of hand. People are making wild accusations without proof. The board will take everything under consideration, but I won't sit here and be attacked by residents who don't appreciate what we do for this community. She gathered her papers and started to walk toward the door. This meeting is adjourned, but Jennifer Martinez spoke up firmly. Margaret, you can't adjourn the meeting unilaterally. We haven't finished addressing the issues that were raised. Margaret stopped at the door and turned around. Her face was red with anger. Fine. You want to coddle troublemakers and people who don't belong here. You deal with it. But don't expect me to sit here and be insulted. She stormed out of the community center, leaving the door open behind her. Robert Blackwell hesitated for a moment, then hurried after his wife. The room buzzed with conversation after Margaret left. Jennifer Martinez looked around at the remaining board members and the crowd of residents. Well, she said with a slight smile, I guess we'll continue without Mrs. Blackwell. Does anyone else have concerns they'd like to share? For the next hour, residents took turns describing their experiences with unfair HOA enforcement. The stories were remarkably similar. Selective targeting of newer residents. 3 days after the emergency board meeting, Margaret Blackwell was back with a vengeance. She had spent the weekend rallying her supporters and planning her counterattack. On Monday morning, she sent an email to every resident in Willowbrook. Estates. Sarah read the email on her phone while drinking her morning coffee. The subject line read, Emergency Community Standards Under Attack. Mark, you need to see this, she called. Mark came to the kitchen and read over her shoulder as Sarah scrolled through the message. Dear Willowbrook Estates residents, the email began. As your HOA president, I am writing to inform you about a serious threat to our community values. A small group of troublemakers is attempting to undermine the rules and standards that have made our neighborhood one of the most desirable in the city. Sarah's mouth dropped open as she continued reading. These individuals want to eliminate property maintenance requirements, allow commercial vehicles in residential driveways, and remove restrictions on noise and unsightly decorations. If they succeed, our property values will plummet, and our peaceful community will be destroyed. The email went on to describe Sarah and Mark as entitled newcomers who refused to follow basic community guidelines, and suggested that real residents needed to stand up to protect their neighborhood. "She's trying to turn the whole community against us," Mark said, his voice tight with worry. The email concluded with an announcement. "I am calling a special community meeting for this Thursday evening to address these threats to our community. Every concerned resident should attend to protect the values that make Willowbrook Estates special." Sarah felt her anger rising, but she also felt something else: determination. Margaret was escalating the conflict, but she was also making mistakes. The email was so over the top that reasonable people would see through it. "She's panicking," Sarah told Mark. "People at the last meeting heard the truth. Now she's trying to control the narrative before she loses more support." But Margaret's email was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the harassment campaign intensified in ways that made their previous troubles seem minor. On Tuesday, Sarah came home from work to find that someone had dumped a bag of garbage on their front lawn. Rotting food and coffee. Grounds were scattered across their grass. A note attached to the bag read, "This is what happens to people who don't belong here." On Wednesday, Mark discovered that their mailbox had been vandalized. Someone had spray-painted the word traitors across the front in red letters. When he called the police, the officer who responded was the same one who had been skeptical about their previous vandalism complaint. "Still think this is just random?" Mark asked. The officer shrugged. "Hard to say. Could be kids. You folks been having any disputes with neighbors?" Mark almost laughed at the question. "You could say that." But the worst incident happened on Thursday morning, just hours before Margaret's community meeting was scheduled to begin. Sarah was getting ready for work when she heard a loud crash from outside. She looked out their bedroom window and saw that someone had thrown a brick through the windshield of her car. This time, when the police arrived, they took the incident more seriously. The brick had been wrapped in a piece of paper with a threatening message: "Leave now or things get worse." "This looks like targeted harassment," the responding officer said. "Have you been receiving threats from anyone?" Sarah showed him the
emails and violation notices they had received from Margaret. She also told him about the escalating conflict with the HOA board.
"I can't prove that Mrs. Blackwell is directly responsible for these incidents," the officer said. "But I can file a report and recommend that you document everything. If this continues, you might want to consider getting a restraining order, Ray." And Mark spent Thursday afternoon getting the windshield repaired and installing a security camera system at their house. Sarah had decided she was not going to be intimidated, but she also was not going to be careless. As evening approached, Sarah faced a difficult decision. Should she attend Margaret's community meeting? Part of her wanted to stay home and avoid further confrontation. But another part of her knew that hiding would only make Margaret stronger. "I have to go," she told Mark as they ate a quick dinner. "If I don't show up, Margaret wins by default. She gets to tell her version of events, without anyone challenging her." Mark nodded, though he looked worried. "I'll come with you." "No," Sarah said. "I think it's better if I go alone. Margaret is trying to paint us as troublemakers. If we both show up, it might look like we're trying to intimidate people." As Sarah got ready for the meeting, she faced another decision about what to wear. She wanted to look professional and serious, but she also wanted to send a message about who she really was. She stood in front of her closet, looking at her business suits and casual clothes. Then her eyes fell on something she had not worn in months: her navy dress blue uniform. The uniform hung in the back of the closet, carefully maintained and pressed. Sarah had worn it during her discharge ceremony and a few formal military events, but never in civilian life. Military regulations discouraged wearing uniforms for non-military purposes. But this felt different. Margaret had been attacking her character and her right to belong in the community. Maybe it was time to remind everyone exactly who they were dealing with. Sarah put on the uniform slowly, adjusting each piece carefully. The dark blue jacket with its gold buttons and service ribbons, the crisp white shirt and black tie, the matching blue skirt and black shoes polished to a mirror shine. When she looked in the mirror, Sarah saw the person she had been for 8 years of her life. A naval officer who had commanded respect and faced down challenges much bigger than a neighborhood bully. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door. The community center was even more crowded than it had been for the emergency meeting. Sarah estimated that nearly 70 residents had come to hear Margaret's presentation. As she walked toward the entrance, several people stared at her uniform with surprise and curiosity. Sarah kept her head high and her shoulders straight as she entered the building. She had learned long ago that confidence and bearing were often more important than words. Margaret was already at the front of the room, setting up a PowerPoint presentation on a large screen. She wore an expensive-looking black suit and had her hair styled in an elaborate updo. She looked like she was preparing for a political campaign rally rather than a neighborhood meeting. Sarah took a seat in the back row, hoping to observe without drawing too much attention. But her uniform made that impossible. Heads turned throughout the room as people noticed her. Some looked curious, others seemed hostile, and a few appeared sympathetic. Margaret began her presentation at exactly 7 o'clock. She had prepared an elaborate slideshow with photos of well-maintained properties and carefully maintained landscaping. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret said, her voice projecting authority, "we are here tonight to protect the community we have all worked so hard to build. Willowbrook Estates is not just a place to live. It is a lifestyle, a commitment to excellence and shared values." Margaret clicked through slides showing pristine lawns, perfectly painted houses, and neatly trimmed hedges. "This is what we have accomplished together. Property values in our neighborhood are 30% higher than the surrounding areas. Crime is virtually non-existent. Children can play safely in our streets." The presentation continued for nearly 20 minutes. Margaret painted a picture of a community under siege from people who wanted to destroy everything that made it special. "Some residents have complained about our enforcement procedures," Margaret said, her tone becoming more serious. "They want us to ignore violations and let standards slip. They want to park commercial vehicles in residential driveways. They want to eliminate noise restrictions and allow unsightly decorations." Several people in the audience nodded in agreement. Sarah could see that Margaret's message was resonating with some residents, particularly older homeowners who had lived in the neighborhood for many years. Margaret's tone became even more dramatic. "If we give in to these demands, our community will become just another rundown suburb. Property values will collapse. The peace and safety we enjoy will disappear." Then Margaret did something that surprised everyone in the room. She clicked to a new slide that showed photos of Sarah and Mark's house. The photos had been taken from multiple angles and showed their property in detail. "This is what happens when standards are not enforced," Margaret said, pointing to the screen. "Unauthorized landscaping, improperly positioned mailboxes, vehicles parked in violation of our guidelines." Sarah looked at the photos in disbelief. Their house looked perfectly normal to her. The landscaping was neat and attractive. The mailbox looked identical to every other mailbox on the street. Their car was parked in their own driveway. But Margaret was not finished. She clicked to another slide that showed what she claimed were problem properties throughout the neighborhood. Sarah recognized several of the houses as belonging to people who had spoken up at the previous meeting. "These residents want special treatment," Margaret continued. "They think that military service or professional backgrounds entitle them to ignore community standards. But in Willowbrook Estates, everyone follows the same rules." The applause continued for nearly a minute before gradually dying down. Sarah remained standing at the front of the room, her military bearing giving her a commanding presence that even Margaret could not ignore. When the room finally became quiet again, Sarah continued speaking. "Mrs. Blackwell has painted me and my husband as troublemakers who don't respect community standards," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly throughout the room. "Let me share with you what really happened over the past 6 months." Sarah walked over to Margaret's podium and set down a folder she had brought with her. Every violation notice we received was for things that other residents were doing without penalty. Every fine was issued without following proper HOA procedures. Every threat was made without board authorization. She opened her folder and pulled out a stack of photographs. These pictures show identical conditions at properties throughout the neighborhood. Long grass, decorative items, parked vehicles, landscaping features. The only difference is that other residents were not cited for these supposed violations. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. Sarah recognized him as Mr. Peterson from Oak Street. "Young lady, can I see those pictures?" Sarah handed him the stack of photos. Mr. Peterson looked through them carefully, then passed them to the person next to him. Soon the photos were being passed around the entire room. As people examined the evidence, murmurs of surprise and concern filled the community center. It was becoming clear to everyone that Sarah and Mark had indeed been singled out for unfair treatment. Margaret finally found her voice. "This is ridiculous," she said, though her usual commanding tone had been replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. "Mrs. Chen is trying to distract from the fact that she and her husband have repeatedly violated clearly stated community guidelines." Sarah turned to face Margaret directly. "Mrs. Blackwell, you sent us 23 violation notices in 6 months. Can you tell this room how many notices were sent to other residents during that same period?" Margaret's face grew even redder. "I don't have to justify HOA enforcement procedures to you." "Actually, you do," came a voice from the audience. Jennifer Martinez, the HOA secretary, had stood up in the middle of the room. "I've been reviewing the records since our last meeting. In the 6 months that the Chens received 23 violations, the rest of the entire neighborhood received a total of 4 violation notices." A wave of shocked conversations swept through the room. The disparity was so extreme that even Margaret's supporters looked uncomfortable. Jennifer continued, "I also discovered that none of the violations sent to the Chens were approved by the board, as required by our bylaws. Mrs. Blackwell acted unilaterally in every case." Margaret pointed an accusing finger at Jennifer. "You're supposed to support the board, not undermine it." "I am supporting the board," Jennifer replied calmly. "I'm ensuring that we follow our own rules and procedures, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." David Park, the engineer who served on the board, stood up next. "Margaret, I've also been looking into the financial records. The legal threat letter that was sent to the Chens cost the HOA over $800 in attorney fees. That expenditure was never approved by the board, and it may have been illegal since no board vote authorized legal action." The room was buzzing with angry conversations now. Many residents were clearly upset to learn that HOA funds had been wasted on unauthorized legal threats. An older woman near the back of the room stood up. Sarah recognized her as Mrs. Foster, one of the longtime board members. "I helped establish this HOA 15 years ago," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We created these rules to protect all residents fairly, not to give one person the power to harass families they don't like." Mrs. Foster looked directly at Margaret. "Margaret, you have violated every principle this organization was founded on. You have brought shame on this community and wasted our money on personal vendettas." More residents began standing up to share their own experiences with unfair HOA enforcement. The young couple from Oak Street talked about being fined for their children's sidewalk chalk art. An elderly man described being cited for a bird feeder that attracted pest animals. While identical bird feeders throughout the neighborhood were ignored, Tom Bradley, who had spoken at the previous meeting, stood up again. "I want everyone to know that my wife and I are immigrants from El Salvador. We saved for 10 years to buy our house in this neighborhood. When Margaret started targeting us with violations, she made it clear that she didn't think we belonged here." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized the full scope of Margaret's harassment campaign. It was not just about her family. Margaret had been systematically targeting anyone she considered undesirable: military families, immigrants, young families with children, and anyone who worked full-time and could not be home during the day to immediately address minor issues. Veteran in his 60s stood up near the middle of the room. He wore a baseball cap with Vietnam veteran embroidered on the front. "Ma'am," he said, addressing Sarah with obvious respect. I served 2 tours in Vietnam. When I came home, I faced people who didn't appreciate my service. I thought those days were behind us. He turned to face Margaret. Mrs. Blackwell, you should be ashamed of yourself for attacking a veteran who served her country with honor. This young woman deserves our respect, not harassment. The veteran's words seemed to resonate throughout the room. Several other veterans stood up to show their support for Sarah. The tide of public opinion was clearly shifting. Margaret looked around the room with growing desperation. Her carefully planned presentation had backfired completely. Instead of rallying support against Sarah, she had exposed her own misconduct to the entire community. "You're all being manipulated," Margaret said, her voice rising to almost a shout. "Mrs. Chen is using her military service to distract from the fact that she refuses to follow basic community rules. She thinks her background gives her special privileges." Sarah had heard enough. She stepped forward and spoke in the same clear, authoritative voice she had used to command sailors on Navy ships. "Mrs. Blackwell, I have never asked for special treatment because of my military service. I have simply asked to be treated fairly like any other resident. You have denied me that basic courtesy because of your personal prejudices." Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. "You have violated your own organization's bylaws repeatedly. You have wasted community funds on unauthorized legal actions. You have harassed multiple families based on nothing more than your personal biases." She gestured toward the audience. "Look around this room. These are good people who work hard and take care of their homes. They deserve better leadership than someone who abuses her power to settle personal grudges." Margaret seemed to realize that she was losing control of the situation. She gathered her papers and moved toward the door. "I don't have to listen to this," she said. "I've served this community faithfully for years. If you want to destroy everything we've built, that's your choice." But before Margaret could leave, Mrs. Foster spoke up again. "Margaret, sit down. We're not finished here." Mrs. Foster's tone carried the authority of someone who had been a respected community leader for many years. Even Margaret seemed to recognize that walking out now would only make her look worse. Reluctantly, Margaret returned to her seat at the board table. Mrs. Foster addressed the room. "I think it's clear that we need new leadership for this HOA. Margaret has violated her duties as president and damaged the trust that residents should have in their elected representatives." Jennifer Martinez nodded in agreement. "I move that we hold a vote of no confidence in Margaret Blackwell as HOA president." "Seconded," said David Park immediately. Margaret jumped to her feet. "You can't do this. I was elected by the residents of this community, and we can remove you for cause," Mrs. Foster replied calmly. "Your actions over the past months have clearly demonstrated that you are unfit to serve in a leadership position." The vote was held immediately. Of the approximately 70 residents present, 62 voted to remove Margaret as HOA president. Only 5 residents voted against the motion, and 3 abstained. Margaret's face went through several different shades of red before settling on a pale white. She looked around the room as if she could not believe what had happened. Robert Blackwell, her husband, had been sitting quietly throughout the meeting. Now he stood up and put his hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Come on," he said quietly. "Let's go home." Margaret shook off his hand. "This isn't over," she said, looking directly at Sarah. "You think you've won something here tonight, but you don't. Understand what you've done. You've destroyed a community that took years to build." Sarah looked back at Margaret with the same steady gaze she had used when facing hostile situations during her military service. "Mrs. Blackwell, I haven't destroyed anything. I've simply stood up to a bully who was abusing her power." Margaret's expression became even more bitter. "You military types are all the same. You think you can come into an established community and change everything to suit yourselves." The room fell silent at Margaret's words. Even her few remaining supporters looked uncomfortable with the obvious prejudice in her statement. Sarah's voice remained calm and professional. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the front porch of her home and looked out at Maple Street. The same street looked completely different now, though nothing physical had really changed. The houses were the same, the lawns were still green and well-maintained, and the sidewalks were still clean and safe. but the feeling of the neighborhood had transformed completely. Children played freely in front yards without their parents worrying about violation notices for chalk art or toys left outside. Neighbors chatted with each other over fences without fear that friendly conversations might be reported as disturbances. People parked their cars in their driveways without measuring distances to curbs with rulers. The change had not happened overnight. Sarah's first month as interim HOA president had been challenging as she worked to rebuild trust and establish new procedures. Her first official act had been to cancel all outstanding fines that had been issued without proper board approval. This meant that she and Mark no longer owed thousands of dollars in penalties, and neither did the other families who had been targeted by Margaret's harassment campaign. The decision had not been popular with everyone. A few longtime residents complained that troublemakers were being rewarded for breaking rules. But Sarah had stood firm. "We cannot build a fair community on the foundation of unfair enforcement," she had explained at her first board meeting. As president, Sarah's second major decision had been to revise the HOA's enforcement procedures. All violation notices now required approval from at least 2 board members before being sent to residents. More importantly, the HOA established a formal appeals process that gave residents the right to challenge violations and present evidence in their defense. The new procedures also required that enforcement be consistent throughout the neighborhood. If one resident was cited for long grass, then all residents with similar grass length would be cited. No more selective targeting based on personal grudges or prejudices. Margaret Blackwell had not gone quietly into retirement. For the first few weeks after losing her position, she had continued trying to cause trouble. She sent emails to residents claiming that the new leadership was destroying property values. She called the city government to complain about HOA mismanagement. She even tried to organize a petition to reinstate her as president, but Margaret's support had evaporated after the community meeting, where her misconduct was exposed. Most residents were relieved to finally have fair and consistent leadership. The few people who still supported Margaret were mainly longtime residents who missed the old days when the HOA was run like a private club. The situation had come to a head when Margaret was caught putting fake violation notices on the doors of residents she disliked. Jennifer Martinez had witnessed Margaret placing a notice on Tom Bradley's door in the middle of the night. The notice claimed that Tom's lawn ornaments violated community standards, but it was not printed on official HOA letterhead and had not been approved by the board. When confronted with evidence of this behavior, Margaret finally seemed to realize that her campaign was hopeless. She and Robert put their house on the market and moved to a retirement community in Florida. Their departure had brought a sense of relief to many residents who had been walking on eggshells for months. Sarah's biggest challenge as HOA president had been balancing the need for community standards with respect for individual rights. She believed that neighborhoods should be well-maintained and attractive, but she also believed that enforcement should be reasonable and fair. Under her leadership, the HOA focused on issues that actually affected property values and community safety. Serious violations like houses in disrepair or genuinely dangerous conditions were addressed promptly. Minor issues like grass that was slightly too long or mailboxes positioned a few inches off the required mark were ignored unless they became chronic problems. The new approach had worked well. Property values in Willowbrook Estates continued to rise, but residents no longer lived in fear of arbitrary penalties. The neighborhood maintained its reputation as a desirable place to live while becoming much more welcoming to families and working people. Sarah had also worked to make the HOA more transparent and democratic. Board meetings were now held monthly instead of quarterly, and all residents were encouraged to attend and participate. Meeting minutes were posted online within a week of each meeting. The HOA's budget was reviewed publicly every quarter. Most importantly, Sarah had established clear term limits for board positions. No one could serve as president for more than 4 consecutive years, and all board positions had to be re-elected every 2 years. The days of HOA boards being dominated by a small group of longtime residents were over. The changes had attracted positive attention from outside the community. The local newspaper had written a feature article about Willowbrook Estates' transformation from HOA horror story to model community. Real estate agents were using the neighborhood's new reputation for fair governance as a selling point. But the change that meant the most to Sarah was simpler and more personal. She and Mark felt like they truly belonged in their neighborhood. Now, they had friends among their neighbors. They enjoyed working in their garden and taking care of their home without constantly worrying about violations. They had started talking seriously about having children and raising a family in Willowbrook Estates. On this particular Saturday morning, Sarah was preparing for the monthly HOA board meeting. As interim president, she would be presenting a report on the community's progress and discussing plans for several improvement projects that residents had requested. The meeting agenda included installing new playground equipment in the community park, organizing a neighborhood barbecue for the 4th of July, and establishing a community garden where residents could grow vegetables and flowers together. These were the kinds of issues that Sarah enjoyed working on, projects that brought people together instead of driving them apart. Mark came outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Sarah and sat down on the porch steps beside her. "Big meeting today?" he asked. "Not too bad," Sarah replied. "We're voting on the playground equipment and finalizing plans for the community garden. Mrs. Williams is very excited about having a place to grow her tomatoes." Mark smiled. "Remember when our biggest worry was whether our mailbox was exactly 18 inches from the curb?" Sarah laughed. "Those days feel like a lifetime ago. I can't believe we almost let Margaret drive us out of our home." "I'm proud of you for fighting back," Mark said. "You turned a terrible situation into something positive for everyone." Sarah sipped her coffee and looked up and down the street. The Johnson children were riding bicycles on the sidewalk. Mr. Garcia was working in his front garden, which now included several colorful decorations that would have earned him violations under Margaret's regime. Mrs. Williams was sitting on her front porch reading a book, her small American flag hanging proudly in her window. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said. "We didn't just solve our own problem. We made things better for everyone." A car pulled up in front of the Bradley house across the street. Tom Bradley got out and waved to Sarah and Mark. His family had become good friends with the Chens over the past few months. "Sarah," Tom called out, "are you ready for the big vote today?" "My kids are really excited about the new playground. We'll get it approved," Sarah called back. "The budget looks good and everyone seems to support it." As Sarah finished her coffee and prepared to leave for the meeting, she reflected on how much her life had changed since moving to Willowbrook Estates. She had come home from military service looking for a quiet, peaceful life. Instead, she had found herself in a battle for basic fairness and respect. But she had learned something important from the experience. Peace was not something that just happened naturally. It had to be created and protected by people who were willing to stand up for what was right. Sarah had served her country overseas, defending American values in foreign lands. Now she was serving her community at home, ensuring that those same values of fairness, equality, and respect for individual rights were upheld in her own neighborhood. As she drove to the community center for the board meeting, Sarah thought about the future. In a few months, there would be regular elections for all HOA board positions. Sarah intended to run for a full term as president. She had found her calling in community leadership, and she wanted to continue building on the positive changes that had been made. She also thought about the other communities that might be struggling with similar problems. HOA abuse was not unique to Willowbrook Estates. There were probably neighborhoods all over the country where residents were being harassed by petty tyrants who had forgotten that their job was to serve the community, not rule it. Maybe there were ways she could help other communities learn from Willowbrook Estates' experience. Maybe she could speak at conferences or write articles about fair HOA governance. Her military training had taught her to think strategically about larger missions, not just immediate tactical problems. But for now, Sarah was focused on the work at hand. She had a community to serve and neighbors who were counting on her leadership. She had playground equipment to approve, community gardens to plan, and 4th of July barbecues to organize.